It is a real privilege and a pleasure for me to introduce and now chat for the next 45 minutes. And if we have to be stopped, because I refuse to acknowledge the 45 minutes, one of you will have to do it. John Naughton here, Professor John Naughton, is a remarkable man. He's remarkable in many facets. He has been an inspiration for the ideas we've been talking about at Ireland's Edge for a long time now. And we're delighted to have him with us in Ballina. He was born in Ballina in 1946, and he has had a much storied career since then, and we're delighted to bring him back. When I say he's remarkable for a number of things. He is a historian of the internet, in effect, which is in its mid-40s. For those of you who are not fully aware of, that's how old the internet is. His research interests and all of his efforts in public education are about understanding the impacts of that technology, of that network on society. And for his contributions, we are, and I think we should be, profoundly grateful. He's remarkable in terms of the breadth of his scholarship, the nature of the interdisciplinary discussions that he's been involved in hosting, convening, and in driving. He's also remarkable in the effort that he has put in over a very sustained career to bridge the gap between the public space, this technology space, and one of his titles is as a professor for the public understanding of technology. I was introduced to him by one of a very long-running column called The Networker, which is a highlight of my Sunday morning weekly, in The Observer, which is exploring all of these issues. So I'm delighted to have him with us, and I think he will be too. So. Yes. John, 1946. What was Ballina like for you as John's, like many people in this area, he is a proud product of Mayo and Galway. And the start was in Ballina, and it moved a long way westward since then.
Well, thank you for the welcome, and thank you for being here. I'm reminded of something that Abraham Lincoln said when he was on the campaign trail many years. He came to a town meeting in a small town in the United States, and it was packed. And he said, "I'm so pleased," he said, "to see such a dense crowd here tonight." And somebody at the back said, "Mr. Lincoln, we ain't all dense." Okay. So, but just for the record, I was born right across the road here. In a house which has now been replaced by Penny's. And once, in a sentimental visit, I went through Penny's to find the exact spot where I was born. And I had to go through the women's lingerie section. And I got some very funny looks. And if the store detective had appeared and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" I'd say I was trying to find the place where I was born. But I decided I wouldn't. Okay. So that's where I came from. And I lived in Ballina for 2 years, and then I lived in Westport, and then I lived in Donegal town, which is why I have a Donegal accent. I do. If there are two things I can't stand, it's bigotry and Catholics. And then I lived in Tralee, and then in Limerick, and then in Cork. So I've been up and down the west, the Wild Atlantic Way before it was famous.
And to UCC for a period?
I read engineering at UCC, and then I went to Cambridge to do research, and then I worked for the Open University, and now I'm back in Cambridge.
And so we're going to talk quite a deal today here about the internet, but before your interest in the internet, there was your interest in radio, which has a special connection with the house in which we are now and the Clark family.
Yes.
Talk to us about that.
Well, because my father was very interested. My father worked in the post office here, and he was very interested in shortwave radio, but he never was able to get a license for various reasons. Some of it financial, some of it, I guess, conceptual. I don't know. But anyway, he had a good friend here who was Jackie Clark's brother, Ian Clark, and Ian Clark was a radio ham. Anybody know what that was? An amateur radio operator. He had
I
a
think
short-
you might illuminate for some people
Well,
in the audience.
in the old days, it was possible to get a license from the post office, as it then was, a kind of wireless telegraphy license, where you could run a transmitter, a shortwave transmitter, which would enable you to communicate with people all over the world by shortwave radio. And in Ireland of the 1950s, that was really astonishing. And my father was friendly with this man, Ian Clark, to whom he had... And if you wanted to have a radio amateur license, you had to be able to use Morse code. And my father, who was an expert in Morse code, because he had been taught it in the post office, he taught Ian Clark, he taught him Morse. And so they were friends as young men. And later on in the 1950s, one night, my father said, "Would you like to see Ian Clark's shack," which was what radio amateurs used to call their premises. And so we drove out on the road into this astonishing Georgian house, beautiful Georgian house. I'd never been in a house like it. And we went upstairs to this room where there was a big bank of equipment with flashing lights and so on. And Ian Clark said he basically switched on the transmitters and so on and sent out the standard call for a wireless operator, which is CQ. Anybody out there? And in Morse, it's da-di-da-da-da-da-di-da. And eventually somebody from New Zealand or somewhere replied, and I nearly dropped dead. I'd never heard anything like this. And I remember thinking, this is what I want to do. And the funny thing was that later on, the internet provided one with a way of doing that without having a license, without knowing telegraphy, without knowing Morse code or anything else. And that's why I thought it was absolutely wonderful. And that's what started me on it. And then what happened as it became clear that the internet was going to become the biggest thing since sliced bread, I became interested in the fact that almost nobody knew about it, and those that had heard of it were dismissive of it. And eventually what happened is I had a conversation with the editor of a major British newspaper, whom I shall not name, and he said to me in that tone of voice the English establishment use when talking to their servants. He said, "Don't you think, dear boy, that this internet thingy is the citizen band radio de nos jours?" And I looked at him and I thought, "You poor sap, you have no idea what's coming." And he didn't. But the point was that he couldn't have known because nobody knew anything about it. So I wrote the history of the net. That's what I did. That's
and
where I got
talk to us about the history of the net and how you divide it into the periods of its lifetime.
It's as Miriam said at the beginning, it's very old technology. The internet that we use today was switched on in January the 1st, 1983. But in fact, its history goes back much earlier than that. It goes back to the 60s and to a project which was funded by the American Department of Defense, by part of the Department of Defense called ARPA. And they built a network which enabled ARPA researchers to communicate using packet switch technology, which is the underlying digital technology of the internet. And they built it in 3 years, basically, and an astonishing achievement, actually, from scratch. And then, having built it, the question, and it was working by the fall of 1972, and having done that, the question was, what will they do next? And they came up with the idea, ARPA came up with the idea that it would fund another project, which they called the Internet Networking Project, which was designed to put together networks which used packet switch technology, which had emerged during the period when the ARPANET was being built. In other words, it was a network that would seamlessly link other networks. That's why it was called the Internetwork. And of course, they dropped in the end. The name became Internet. But that started in '73, and the research on that, and it was completed by the end of 1982. And on January the 1st, 1983, the network that we use today was switched on. And for the first 10 years, nobody except weird people like me knew about it. So it was a kind of parallel universe. And there was this amazing network on which only researchers and people who are working in elite universities and research laboratories could use or used. And then there was the rest of the world. What changed really was that in the late 1980s, Tim Berners-Lee invented the web. all on his own, more or less. And he put it out on the CERN servers, internet servers in 1991. And it's still nobody paid any attention. And then a young undergraduate in 1993 called Mark Andreessen built a web browser, the first web browser, the first thing that looks like a web browser. And from 1993 onwards, the thing exploded. So you can divide the history of the internet into a number of phases. The first phase is the pre-phase up to 1972. Then the second phase is the development phase from 73 to 83. From 83 to 93, it's a sandpit for geeks. And then from 93 onwards, all hell breaks loose.
And I've heard you described one of those as the utopian element of it.
Well,
why did it have that characteristic for you?
If you were using the internet in those early days, then it really did seem like a miracle, because it was the first network in human history that has not been controlled by somebody. When Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn were designing the network, they had two design principles, one of which is that it should never be owned or controlled by anybody, and secondly, that it should be an extremely stupid network that did only one thing. It took in data packets, and it did its best to deliver them. It didn't care what was in the data packets. It was completely agnostic about it. Now, in other words, what they invented, in fact, was a network. They thought that the thing to do was not to assume that they knew what it would be used for. So if you want to make something that's future-proof, one thing you mustn't do is you must not ever design it for something that you know about at the moment. That's why the phone network was no good for computers, because it was only good for voice. So they thought, how do we do this? And the answer is they thought, we'll build a stupid network that does one thing, puts in data packets, and we leave all the ingenuity to the edges. So if you're smart enough to have an idea that can be realized using data packets, then the internet will do it for you, no questions asked. And there's nobody to say you can't do that. Right? So what kinds of things might you do? Well, some guys had, mainly men, some guys had the idea you could use it for telephony. You could just convert your voice into data packets, put them into this network, the network would deliver them to where they're going to go, and then you could convert them back from data packets into voice signals. That's called Skype. And Skype was developed by two guys who had this idea and did it, and there was nobody to say, you can't do that. So essentially what you got was what we later called an architecture for permissionless innovation. You didn't need to ask any permission, you just did it. Tim Berners-Lee didn't need any permission to invent the web, and in the process he built something that's at least as profound as what Gutenberg built. The people who designed Skype didn't need any, and indeed, God help us, in 2004, a young lad called Mark Zuckerberg had an idea. He stole an idea from two nice but dim undergraduates called the Winklevoss twins. And then he wrote the code and he put it on an internet server and he didn't ask anybody's permission. And bingo, here you have. He now controls a virtual country with 2.2 billion inhabitants. So that's why it was significant. It was a global machine for springing surprises. That's what it was. And that's why if you're in that area and you can see this potential, you think, Jesus, there's nothing like this ever. And that's where you get all the utopian kind of, and
you were properly utopian.
Yeah, I really believe this stuff would change humanity, and it still has the potential to do it, but it got hijacked on the way.
And you've mentioned the two gentlemen in particular. I think the web is very interestingly understood as what are nearly two competing visions of a lot of things, but as embodied in the vision of Tim Berners-Lee for the web and Mark Zuckerberg's subsequently. And I use him as an example of a lot of other people. But they're two radically different visions for the use of that.
Yeah. If you think of the internet, the first thing is that the internet should not be confused with anything that runs on it. The web is just an application that runs on the underlying infrastructure. So if you confuse, and people do, if you confuse, for example, the web with the internet, then it's like confusing the different kinds of trucks and cars and things that run on a motorway network with the network itself. The thing that's really important is what the thing runs on, and the internet is what the stuff runs on. And it just so happens then you can have different kinds of things that run on it. In the case of the web, Tim Berners-Lee made a clear decision that in the end he wanted this to be a public resource. Okay, so he built a new platform on top of the platform, the free platform that the internet provided. And he basically said this platform is open to anybody who wants to exploit it, wants to use it. And then on top of that, you get somebody else, Mark Zuckerberg by name, who builds another platform. He builds a new platform on top of the web, but he doesn't want it to be free and open. He wants it to be totally controlled. So you lose. He gets the benefits of the permissionless innovation of the technology, and then he wants to deny the permission for anybody else. That's true of most of these corporations. That's what they do.
And as we look, obviously, then there was a number of characteristics in terms of network effects, in terms of zero marginal costs,
yeah.
in terms of power law distribution, which all came together under that vision to result in a certain form of surveillance capitalism that we're mostly living in today.
Well, I mean, the thing about the digital technology is different from earlier technologies like steam or electricity or whatever. It's different because it has some of these special characteristics. But the characteristics, when you add them together, they all point in one direction. They point towards winner-take-all outcomes. That's what happens, and that is what indeed has happened. In that sense, in that sense, I think some of the outcomes that we're now grappling with are kind of inevitable, but they needn't have been because we didn't know we were making choices at times when we made them. And because of path dependency, you get stuck in ways. So, for example, when you have a social network that has 2.2 billion users, there's never going to be another social network because it's the benefits of
the network
the power of the network is so serious. I've got a really good colleague in Cambridge, Ross Anderson, who's a computer security guy, and he has amazing network, a group of graduate students every year who do research on computer security, and he had a student who was doing research on the security of Facebook, and he comes back after 6 months for his supervision with Ross, and he basically tells Ross, it's a disaster. It's so insecure and so on. And Ross says, I take it you've deleted your Facebook account? And the student says, no. And Ross says, yeah, come on, explain. And he says, Ross, you don't want me to have any sex life or any social life? So that's a network effect, where this guy who knows how dangerous and how fragile and how insecure this system is, and yet he feels he has to continue to use it. And that's the story that we all have. I mean, how many people here have had reservations about using Facebook? And how many people have deleted their Facebook accounts? 1, 2, 3. This is a particularly enlightened place. But you know what I mean? That's a network effect.
Yeah.
And it's really powerful. Really powerful. And it's one of the reasons why we find it so hard to deal with it.
And you now describe yourself as a recovering utopian.
Yeah.
Would you talk about the recovering bit of that?
Well, I did really believe in this because I thought it's my generation. I'm a baby boomer, and all of the people who invented this stuff are my generation. Ben Cerf is the same age as I am, I think, and so on. And because it was done outside of the corporate ethos, because it was done largely, it was funded by the state, but not controlled in any way. So we thought, this is new, this is different, and it will escape from corporate control, and it will enable people to be creative. It will enable people to become global publishers. If you can type, you can become a global publisher because you can have a blog and all that kind of stuff. So it was very seductive, I think, and I think it's I was naive. I think but I was naive because I was optimistic for humanity. I do remember the moment when the first doubt appeared, because I was at a conference in Seattle with a group of people who had been involved in designing this stuff, and I had brought with me to the conference a friend of mine who was a very senior academic a very distinguished academic who knew nothing about the technology but had spent his life studying international relations and the operation of state power. And there was a fervid kind of utopian kind of discussion going on, and this friend of mine, James, said to me, look, I need a break. Let's go and sit outside. And we were sitting outside smoking cigars, and he said to me, do you think this technology is really as revolutionary as what these people think? And I said, I do, James, I do. Because I did. And then he just puffed on the cigar, and after a while I became irritated, and he hadn't said anything. And I said, what do you think, James? And he said, we'll see. We'll see, dear boy. We'll see. And at that moment I started to think, maybe I'm wrong.
And obviously, as most of us probably in this room encountered it, we encountered it in the sign up for something which seems free in a very easy, convenient, seductive kind of a way. And we had no real sense of either the power of our data or the ubiquity of what our data would eventually become in terms of the trails that we all leave. We wouldn't know how that would go off into the auction world this was all opaque too. We had a conversation too earlier this morning with a design panel here actually, and one of the things we talked about on it was, the ability to design for good, or the role of the designer. Again, when most of us signed up for some of those free products, we didn't understand that we were in actually a design for addiction environment.
Yeah, we didn't.
But we were.
We were, and there are two sides to that. One of them is you can't expect, this stuff is quite opaque and it's quite complicated. And so it's unreasonable to expect people who have normal lives, unlike geeks, to kind of to probe into the implications of what they're doing. The second thing is that you're busy, you want to get something, then there's a nice free service which has been offered. You just have to click on this thing, and most of us don't read the 30 pages of boilerplate that go with it, so we just say click yes, okay. That's one of the problems. Now, there was a very interesting experiment a few years ago done by some security guys I know. They set up a free high-speed Wi-Fi service in a tourist area of London. I think it was run by the Houses of Parliament. And they gave you free, it was 2 gigabits. I think it was very, very high-speed, unusually high-speed Wi-Fi free. And it was an experiment. They were doing it with a tourist hotspot, and 300 people signed up. You had to click on the terms and conditions. And 300 people, I think, did click on it before the experiment ended. One of the terms and conditions was, I give you the right to my firstborn child. And everybody had signed. Okay, that's it's wrong to blame people for that. That's blaming the victim, as it were, in a sense, because this stuff, this stuff is not. Those terms and conditions are not put together by well-meaning philanthropists. Mm-hmm. They're put together by teams of lawyers working for giant corporations, and those folks have only one interest, which is to make sure that they have access to all your data and that they're able to do with it what you cannot imagine. Okay, and from that, so the deal is we provide free services, and in the process, and you give us the right to use all your data and to monetize it and to exploit it in various ways. In the case of Facebook, for example, what's being used is that data that you provide, plus your data trails within Facebook, plus all kinds of other stuff, including your credit card record and all kinds of other stuff. What happens is that in the end, Facebook has, according to the research, 98 data points on every single person in this room. 98 separate data points on each of you, right? Why has it got that? Because it enables Facebook to paint a target on your back for an advertiser. So if an advertiser wants 30-year-old single mums living in Ballina who like Pilates and who occasionally drink Baileys, Irish cream, very rare people. I'd say, well, Facebook can deliver all of those to an advertiser. That's what it's for, okay. And The business model, which later became known as surveillance capitalism, that's what it is. And that's at the core of the problem we have, because if your business depends on monetizing data from people, then what you have to do is you have to make sure that the data continually increases. And how do you do that? Well, you design services that are addictive. So, for example, much of the services that we use, and of course the smartphones that we use, are designed using the same kind of applied psychological research that goes into the design of slot machines. A simple example: you're a Facebook user, and you change your profile picture. I'm sure somebody in this room has done that, right? Well, what happens when you change your profile picture? The answer is that, and the psychological research I think shows this, you enter into a phase of slight anxiety, right? Because you want to know actually what your friends think of your new picture. I mean, I know it's ridiculous, but that's
not really.
Okay, well, Facebook's algorithms know that, and so they make sure that, first of all, notification of your profile picture change will appear in your friends' feeds. That's the first thing. What's the purpose of that? That's, first of all, your friends may engage in activity, and every time they do something, click or like or share, then that adds to the monetization potential of the data. And they also know that you will, strangely, spend quite a lot of time checking to see if anybody likes your. Okay, that's a very simple example, but there's hundreds of other examples of the way in which this stuff is designed. It's designed to be addictive. It's designed to keep it. If you look at, for example, let's move away from Facebook for a minute. If you look at Google, which owns YouTube, you know that you watch a video. Somebody sends you a link, you watch a video, and then there will be a set of recommended videos for you, right? Okay, and most people, because Google arranges it, and most people don't spot it, it'll have autoplay selected by default, right? Okay. Now the interesting thing is when you start looking at what the recommender algorithm chooses, what it chooses in general is stuff that's more extreme than what you've just watched. Now, of course, this is easy to understand in relation to terrorism or in relation to hate speech or anything else. But if you're looking, for example, one researcher in the United States recently started looking in other areas, started looking for YouTube videos on vegetarianism. And what happens? The recommender algorithm takes her steadily down to veganism, and then to more extreme forms of veganism, and so on. So the track is the same way. You start with something, and then you get directed to things that are more extreme. You could do it for running, and you get down to 48-day marathon, 48-mile marathon stuff. Now, why is that? It is because the research shows that the thing that keeps people engaged is usually more extreme. It's sad, but true fact. If it's somehow dramatic, or it'll keep you longer on the site. And the longer you stay on the site, the more revenue you generate, or at least more revenue. So we are in a position where we are the users of addictive products. And
I think...
And that's problematic.
One of the other things that's very interesting, John, is the piece that we are... There's two things I'd maybe like for you to explore a little further.
Yeah.
We are the users, but we are not the customer. And given the competition law backdrop that this landed into, I think that became a very important distinction. The other piece is that this landed at a time of a certain form of technological determinism or tech bro solutionism and both of those have probably been very important drivers of. Would you talk a little more of that?
Yeah, the first thing is that we have free services, and so we have a number of corporations which are monopolies in their areas. Facebook is a monopoly in social networking. Google's a monopoly in search. Okay, and the traditional approach to monopoly control, to antitrust legislation, the rest of it, says that what we're looking for are companies that become so dominant that they then use their dominance to to do price gouging.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you can't use that criterion if their services are free. So the first thing is that we, as you said, we're the users, we're not the customers. Who are the customers? The customers are advertisers, right? And so far, there has been no competition law investigation of whether or not there's damage being done there. My hunch is that there is, but so far governments have not moved to that. But if you ever want to understand Facebook, really understand it, can I suggest you go in not as a user, but as an advertiser? Because what happens is Facebook has built this most wonderful machine. It's a software machine. And it's truly beautiful. If you're a software engineer, this is magic. It's beautifully done, and it's very good. You go in as an advertiser. You want to place some kind of ad. Okay, and what happens then is Facebook, it's this amazing system kicks in, and it says, well, you're going to look for custom audiences. Who are you really looking for? And it makes really helpful suggestions as to other people you haven't thought of, and it keeps going. And there have been all kinds of really interesting researches in this. As an academic, I can't do it because it violates ethical guidelines that we have. But I'm glad to say that my journalistic colleagues have no such constraints. And so they've done, for example, one of the, I think it was Politico, did a site where they wanted to put essentially anti-Semitic ads into Facebook. And they went through the system and they watched what the machine suggests. And what the machine suggests, it was saying things like, would you like to target it at people who would like to burn Jews? That's a suggestion that they get from the internal auditing, from the internal advertising system. So you see that's where you really see how this thing works. And that's how you can understand the way it was weaponized by the Russians and others during the election, and perhaps during the Brexit thing as well. That's the real wisdom about Facebook comes from using it as an advertiser. Now, does that cover what you wanted to talk about? Oh, yeah.
I suppose the other piece, and this is back to your point, is, the auctions which are underneath, in which the data is being, there was, as we said, that is the bit that's totally opaque to the rest of us.
Yes.
And we're unaware, as you say, it's not just our individual, but it's the data trails that we're dropping around as we move all day that is ultimately the product here.
But the strange thing is that if you're a user, you can find out what that looks like. Because
have you downloaded your own?
Well, you don't even have to download it. You just have to install a plugin on your browser. For example, there's a very good one called Ghostery. Somebody use it already? Yeah? Okay, well, you use that, and it'll tell you on each page what you find. And you'll find that even on pages that you think are innocent, you might have 28 trackers. And these are small companies you've never heard of, which are extracting your data and selling it across between one another. The other thing is that when you look at a web page, what happens is that your browser sends a request to a server for this page, and the server sends back a whole stream of stuff, and your browser assembles it so that it can be viewed. Okay, and there may be holes. Initially, there may be some holes in the page for an ad. And then eventually an ad appears. Now, that ad has appeared not because somebody has paid for that ad to be displayed exactly for you. What has happened is that in the period between the request for the page and the actual appearance of the page as it's assembled by your browser, there's been a high-speed auction for that space. Right? It's amazing. It happens in milliseconds. It's like high-speed trading on the stock market. And so there's no, and that means that if somebody else is looking at the same page, the high-speed auction will produce a different. Okay, this is the technology we now live with, and most of us innocently use. And of course, for us, it's amazingly convenient, and it's very. I mean, there's no question about it. This is wonderful technology as well, but behind it is this hidden price, which is the way in which your data is being used. That's why, sometimes you may find that you look for something, you try to buy something from John Lewis in the United Kingdom or some innocent kind of retailer, and you're looking at some bizarre garden implement that you thought you might buy. And then for weeks later, you're still pursued every time your browser will put this bloody stuff about garden equipment. Well, that's because your data is constantly being auctioned. as you go through the web.
And in some sense, I suppose, as we've all seen the early iterations of that, that feels kind of clumsy to us.
Yeah.
In a
Yes.
which, in a sense, maybe blinds us to its, or our first experience of some of this, as you say, how most of us use this feels so benign, so banal,
Yeah.
so ultimate, and in many cases, so enlarging of our lives
Yes.
and of our community and of our social networks. It blinds us to some of.
Yes. Yeah. And the problem we have as societies is how do we retain and fund the really valuable parts of this technology without the pernicious sort of side effects of the way in which it currently operates. And the only way out of that is to address the business model that drives it. I mean, the business model we have arises because we wouldn't pay for stuff. And the stuff that we want to have is expensive to provide because it costs a lot to run Facebook. So how's it going to be paid for? One way would be a subscription. Another, that's an honest business model, and there are honest business models on the internet. They're not as prevalent as they should be, but they're.
And how much would it be of all of us? It's in the region of $10, $20 a year or something.
It probably is less than $20 a year. And the question is, would you pay for $20 a year for what you get from Facebook? Probably most of us would, I would say. I don't. But the trouble is that it's a capitalist enterprise, and it has to continually grow. And if you start charging people for subscriptions, then growth, instead of going like that, it goes like that. And for a capitalist firm, that's really bad news. It means you're not growing fast. And that's why, Mark Zuckerberg has said in the congressional testimony that he indicated that it's possible that Facebook might charge for some people. Well, in that case, what would happen is it would charge for premium services, so wealthy people would pay a subscription in return for no advertising. But then you have a new digital divide, because it then means that poor people will be the ones who get,
And what you've described there, John, and we'll come back to some of the other communications technologies that you and others have studied, but you're describing an amassing of corporate power in a very concentrated period of time that, and even as we've, and obviously we've all lived through it this year in terms of the GDPR, and there's been a certain collision of the power of the nation state with the power of the corporate power. And in some ways, will you talk to us about, so I mean, most of us have just experienced GDPR as an endless series of either I get a chance to opt out of that now, or tick and I won't even think about it again. Yeah. But in terms of even now, the right to be forgotten means something very different in this context.
Yeah, I mean, the right to be forgotten is interesting, because actually it isn't the right to be forgotten. It's a right not to be found by a search engine, right? And
who gets to decide that?
The strange thing is that the providers of the search engines get to decide that. I mean, this is what's very interesting about that. You have the decision comes from a sovereign authority, which is the European Court of Justice. It says that European citizens have this right. Okay, so a territorial sovereign says this is, which is right and proper. The court is an accountable body. And then what happens? Well, what happens is that the implementation of that right is outsourced to the company. Okay, so it's to Google you petition. It isn't to the court. So you have this very strange process, and Google makes the decision. There's a process of appeal and so on, but nevertheless, now what's going on there?
Where does that appeal ever end up? Like, is it?
We don't know yet, because it may go through. It'll go through the court of a particular jurisdiction, and then maybe back. But the point that's interesting for me is that you have a territorial sovereign ceding somehow power to what is a functional sovereign, in other words, the company that can do it. You have exactly the same thing in Germany at the moment. The Germans, at the beginning of January this year, formulated an apparently fierce piece of legislation which said to social networks that you must take down certain kinds of stuff within 24 hours, or we'll fine you until there's no tomorrow. And across the world, people have applauded this. This is a way in which states are fighting back against the corporation. Well, up to a point. I mean, but essentially what's happening is that then a number of private corporations are now being, the state, a territorial sovereign, which is the Bundestag, is effectively subcontracting to a couple of private companies what can and cannot be said. Now that's very strange. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of, it reflects, I think, what is happening, which is states are, for the time being at any rate, more or less acknowledging their own impotence and subcontracting things they ought to be doing to very powerful corporations. Now, that probably can't go on forever, but that's what has happened so far, and that's the direction of travel. And you get to the point where you think, well, you know, who's more important? Of course, states are important because they have the monopoly on violence. But actually, you know, can you see any government taking on a corporation that has 2.2 million happy users? I mean, the thing that always reminds me of is prohibition in the United States in the 1920s. I mean, the state basically said, no more alcohol, right? And you know, we tried that.
We know where that went.
Yeah, well, it's not good. Well, the same might be true for social networking, for example. It would be foolish not to, for example, for a state to say you can't have Google because it's a very good search engine, but it does search in a certain way and it extracts a certain hidden price. And again, but most people in this room have used Google to search. Yeah, okay, so it's pretty good. It's pretty good. It's not as good as it used to be, but it is pretty good. So, you know, we're entering some kind of territory where things that we thought of as being fixed, like, for example, monopoly control over monopolists and the primacy of territorial sovereigns like courts,
are shifting.
It's shifting, and it's hard to say where we're going, but we're in new territory for sure. And there's not much about that in the public discourse.
And as you and others like Tim Wu have studied the various technologies which came before this, yeah. Nonetheless, you find some very shared characteristics of some of these journeys.
There's a history. I mean, the problem is that the tech industry, the digital tech industry, is kind of weird. First of all, it's exceptionally male. It is exceptionally skewed in a number of ethnic directions. There are basically no black programmers anywhere in this industry. I mean, almost none. Okay, there are a lot of whites. There are a lot of mostly males, and there are maybe Asians and Chinese. But that's it. It's a very skewed kind of distribution of elites who produce stuff that we use every day. Does that matter? Yes, it matters a lot. In the first place, it means that we get products which are deemed to be desirable and effective by a small number of weird people. I'm not joking. I know these folks. And you get really absurdities. First of all, what you get is leading-edge uselessness. Mm-hmm. For example, a shower head that's networked. Okay, so you can set the temperature of your shower while you're driving home in your Tesla. Okay. You couldn't make this stuff up, but there are people, there are people who think this is a good idea, this is cool, and the rest of it. No, that's a reflection of the extent to which they are weird, not of the extent. That's one bit of it. And I think that's for example, that there have been wellness apps. Wellness being a new fad. There have been wellness apps. Which in their first manifestations omitted to notice that half of the human population is female and has a menstrual cycle. So it's news to guys in Silicon Valley that women have periods. And then you think, okay, how much more of this is there? Actually, there's a lot more. But what you're getting is kind of leading-edge uselessness. And you're getting credulous media which laps it up and so on. It's really cool to have a remotely controlled shower head. Yeah, right. And so that's I think that's really significant and important, and yet it's not sufficiently. I mean, my view often is that the only rational response to the Silicon Valley crowd is ridicule. and what you find is that there isn't that much ridicule, and you wonder why. Well, the answer is, folks, that colossal wealth is an aphrodisiac, in the sense that it renders journalists, for example, that journalists park their brains at the door when they're dealing with very rich young techies. The other thing is that a lot of people in this industry have become rich in their 20s and 30s. I mean, rich beyond their wildest dreams. Okay. Now, the strange thing is, my observation of very rich people is that great wealth tends to lead to the delusion that you are omniscient. If you're somebody who's very rich, then you think basically that you are wise and smart. And funnily enough, nobody around you is going to question that.
Tell you otherwise.
Okay? Now, that's always been a problem with rich bastards in their 60s. Okay? Right? But now we have people in their 30s who are, like Peter Thiel and others, who are rich beyond their wildest imaginings. And people are taking these not as seriously because they're rich. And it's a strange kind of phenomenon. It's a reflection of our media, of our culture and everything else. It's just weird. And my feeling is that the only rational response sometimes is to laugh at them. But you try laughing at them and they don't get it. It's really funny.
And John, another one for which you have devoted a large part of your life is education and public education. You're now a grandfather.
Yes.
What is the appropriate way for the education system that your grandchildren live in to engage in this networked world?
I think we need to change our attitudes. For example, if you're a parent or a grandparent, but certainly a parent, the first thing you have to do, I think, is you have to stop drooling over the fact that your 2-year-old granddaughter can use an iPad, right? That's the first thing you need to stop doing, because that is possibly the worst thing anybody could do to a child, okay? First thing. Because essentially what we're drooling over is the ability of our beloved small family member to become an adept user of a technology designed by people who do not have her interests at heart. Okay? Now, the user thing is important because what I would like to have is I'd like to have education of young people in this technology, and they have to know some things that only techies know normally and is not normally discussed. The first thing is that any technological product, any digital product, is something that was designed by somebody for a purpose and which could be changed. It's not the fact that it says that the warranty is void if you open the box is an extremely pernicious and illiberal view in a way to protect intellectual property at the expense of social good. The point about any of this stuff is that it is designed by somebody, written by somebody, has values embodied in it, and those values may or may not be ones that we approve of or share. That's the first thing people have to know about this stuff. It is not a black box that you have to take on a take it or leave it basis. You have to say, as any techie will say, well, this stuff is weird. It may be interesting, it may be nice to use, it may be nice to design, it may have good user interface and so on, but that's not the point. The point is that, first of all, it is an artifact created by humans who have interests, which may or may not be yours. That's the first bit of it. So if we don't get to this, then what's facing our kids in the end is a world where their only choice is program or be programmed. This is the key bit of this. And the more I see people glorying in the adeptness of kids to use smartphones or whatever, I think that's not what we want. What we want is for them to understand what these devices are doing to them, and also what could be changed in them. That's not for a few years I played a very small part in a campaign in Britain with some computer scientists to try and persuade Michael Gove, who was then a normal human being, and he was Secretary of State for Education. And at that time, he seemed normal. And what we wanted to do, we wanted to persuade him that the British curriculum for ICT, for secondary PGCE, that's up to Intercert or whatever it is here now, should be changed, because it had become basically a deadbeat course in which students were basically trained to use Microsoft software. God help us. And so you would give talks to Parent Teachers Association and say, look, this is wrong. We're giving our kids an ICT training, and they should have ICT education, so they understood what this stuff meant. They had a working knowledge about their freedom of choice in it, and the need to change and all the rest of it. I got nowhere, because as one parent said to me once, look, I don't see what you're on about. My kid is learning to use Excel, right? Microsoft Excel, and well, that's a useful skill, and when she goes to work, it'll be helpful in the rest of it. And the other parents nodded. And eventually I tried an experiment, and the experiment was, all right, we give them ICT training, and I say they want ICT, they need ICT education. Let's just swap ICT for sex. Would you like your children to have sex training? Or would you like them to have sex education? Okay. That captures it. That's what it's about. And as parents, we need to work on that. So from my point of view, the moment I look forward to is the moment when my grandson breaks the warranty on his iPhone and opens it up. And then when Apple sues, I'll take him on.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, we'll finish with that note of clarity, humour, and good intent for society, which characterises all of John's contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you.